Firstly, they're two very hard acts to follow, aren't they? Both Michael and John. And I think half of my presentation's already been covered, which is great, because one of the main points I want to make is that there's convergence around what consumers see as important in areas of engagement and what researchers and funding bodies and now even journals see as important. Is Michael still in the room? Because I wanted to say that not only was that one of the best and most heartfelt welcome to countries I've ever experienced, I think that what Michael was telling us is actually at the heart of what is good and respectful and proper consumer involvement. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're on and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. But I'd also like to pay my respects to the leaders and the elders of the health consumer movement, some of whom are here today. Thank you. Because while John told us about some of the drivers around involving consumers in research, the real engine behind this has been those people who have been working away at this for some 20 plus years. The two examples of cancer and HIV that were mentioned as, I think, great examples of really passionate, driven consumers who have insisted that we be involved in designing health systems and health services that are better for us, and nothing about us without us is what we're all about. So Health Consumers New South Wales, we're state-based and an independent organisation. We're a membership-based organisation, so feel free to come up and talk to me afterwards if you're interested in joining. And we work hard to involve consumers and their families in the design and delivery of health services. So what do we mean when we talk about involvement? So people who have been, people may have seen things very similar to this, the so-called spectrums of engagement, and people who are involved in healthcare delivery and health services might groan when I show this, because it comes out of the some of the standards that services are accredited by. And I won't go through this in detail, because what this is, I think, is a white fella and bureaucratic and academic way of talking about those issues of respect, listening, walking together and forming genuine relationships, which is what Michael was so eloquently talking to us about. So what I wanted to present to people today was the results of some work that we did a couple of years ago now, when at Health Consumers New South Wales, for a long time, our focus was around involving consumers in the design and delivery of health services and what that meant. And then I'd say maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we started to get a lot of requests around how do we involve consumers in research. By coincidence, I have a research background. I'm very interested and passionate about this, and must admit that in my former life as a researcher, I wasn't particularly good at this, and made me think about, oh my goodness, what have I missed out on here? So what we did was, using those principles of engagement, instead of sitting back and saying, well, as the peak body, we know what this is about, we actually got together some consumers who have been involved in research, who have been involved in that co-design of research, to ask them about their experience. And that resulted in this publication around what consumers told us is important to them. I have some hard copies with me today if people want some. On my slides, I've also got the link to our to the website where people can get a soft coffee if that's what they prefer. So when we spoke to people, as I said, who had experience in the design, development and implementation of research, these are the things that they told us was important to them and what impacts on consumer involvement in research. And I think you'll see some parallels to what John told us from their work as well. So people realised that some of the challenges actually arose around the type of research that people were being asked to be involved in. So for example, some people were involved in basic science research, and that was very challenging to find where the consumer role happens there. People were going to research meetings and being asked about some quite technical opinions on sort of scientific methodologies, and they realised that wasn't the good fit for them. Other consumer researchers who've been involved in things like health systems research found it a much easier fit and a much better place. So the type of research impacts on the type of involvement. The availability of consumers. I noticed one of the things that was mentioned in the previous slide was a discussion around involving consumers in reimbursement, which is fantastic. But the idea and to remember that by their very nature, we're often engaging with and talking with people who have health conditions, sometimes serious health conditions, who have caring and other responsibilities. And so finding people who were available, interested to be engaged at the time and in the manner that research traditionally engages people could be a challenge. So matching how we engage to people's own life contexts. The funding of consumer engagement. And again, echoing what John said, that this is something that needs investment. That we don't plonk researchers on committees and say, well, now your research, go ahead and cure cancer. There's lots of training and involvement to be able to be involved. And consumers need similar investment and similar support. And many people spoke about the difficulty that they had in getting up to speed to a point where they thought that they were contributing at a level where they thought they were making a difference. The idea of finding the right consumer, which might be something strange to hear coming out of consumer research, but what they meant was people who had the relevant experience that they were looking for. So John mentioned that yes, in some sense, we are all consumers. We're all users of or potential users of health services. But obviously in research and in work with health services, we're looking for people with specific experiences of specific diseases, experiences of specific interventions. So making sure that was clear, and also that we had people who had an interest and a temperament and an understanding about what was happening and the purpose of research. And again, some of that gets back to the support we give to consumers in the early stages, but a lot of that's also about the selection processes. And again, when we select professionals and researchers to work on on new projects, we look at a whole range of experience that they bring. So it was around looking at the experiences and the knowledges the consumer brings to get the best fit. The training and support was particularly highlighted as areas that people felt they needed more to develop that better understanding of not just what research is, but things like research timelines. What's my role? What am I actually contributing to here? And this was John's research that he reported on is very heartening. It's very heartening to hear from researchers who are so passionate about consumer involvement. But unfortunately, not everybody we spoke to had encountered researchers as empathetic and broad-minded as John. And for some, they found that the biggest barrier was actually having researchers who understood the value of what consumers bring. And I think some of that evidence that John brought to the table is going to be really valuable in shifting researchers' opinions. And just as there needs to be some investment and capacity building for consumers in these roles, there also was a need for working with researchers around how do they work with consumers. Because John mentioned some of those drivers that are out there from funding bodies, from journals that are encouraging researchers to get involved, to bring consumers in and involve consumers. But what very few of those bodies do is actually start to say, well, this is how you do it. This is what, these are some of the ways to get consumers involved, which is not part of researcher training at the moment. So there's a need to invest in that and to build the capacity of researchers. This next point is really important, about being clear around people's roles and expectations. I mentioned before that some consumers who'd been involved in some basic science research found that they were entering into discussions or were expected to contribute to discussions about areas that were outside their area of expertise. And that's not because the researchers didn't want them there. They were actually quite excited young researchers who were being told, we have to talk to consumers. We're really excited about the type of research that we do, so let's have that conversation. Whereas the roles that consumers bring is that understanding and that experience of being healthy, of being unwell, and of receiving treatment. And hopefully even finding people who have experience of being in research trials, so that's what they bring. So defining and being clear around those roles and expectations was an area of some tension. And finally, clarity of language, plain English, moving away from technical jargon, and again, getting back to that understanding of the roles and what consumers bring, and talking in a language that everybody understands. I'll just flick through this. This is some of the things that the consumers identified that they could bring to the table. Creating sort of a consumer-approved type logo. And actually Cancer Voices New South Wales, a consumer organisation, has developed such a logo, and I've got information on that in the slide deck that you can look at when it's sent to you. People are interested in being more involved in the ethical review of projects, and actually again we heard from John examples about how having consumers involved can challenge not only existing ethical processes, but I think make sure that community and consumer expectations are part of the research design and research outcome. This point is, again, I think it's really important that consumers bring an understanding of the experience of being in a clinical trial. We talk a lot about patient experience in health services and have developed a whole range of measures around patient experience, and the patient experience of using a service is something we really consider. Consumers can bring an idea about what it's actually going to be like for a participant to be part of a trial and go on that journey of being in a trial. And finally, consumers wanted to be involved in discussions around developing a set of guidelines or principles about how to engage consumers in research. So that's what consumers told us in a nutshell. And as I said, there's more details in that publication. When I was invited to give this talk, I was also asked to say, what would I like to see in research? So if you could indulge me for just a couple more minutes, this is what I'd like to see in research. And only some of it's directly about consumer involvement, but consumers can add to this. Obviously, I'd like to see a research culture where consumers are involved at all levels and across a whole different range of research, and where consumers are involved in setting the agenda. I was quite interested in that figure that we heard before, that 40% of research is investigator instigated, and then 60% is sponsor driven. Of course, we need investigators and the sponsors to be driving research, but I think somewhere in there we have to have research that's identified by consumers as well. I'd like to see more work done on informed consent, and informed consent for people being involved, not just in trials, but in involvement in research, and honest discussions about the safety and risk that's involved in being involved in a trial. The reason why I chose this particular photograph was because it was from a story that was in the Good Weekend magazine a couple of Saturdays ago, that was looking at the issues around transvaginal mesh and pelvic mesh. And that, to me, in many ways, was the perfect storm about how researchers, regulators, industry, and clinicians got somehow sidetracked and lost sight of patient safety. And I think we need to have sort of more of those discussions and transparency about researchers' involvement, researchers' associations, and researchers' interests. I know that's happening, but I think those discussions need to be had more with participants and also with consumers who are involved in research design. And linked to that is accountability that comes through better transparency. And finally, I'd like to see better communication. Better communication with the general community about the outcomes of medical research that's more than a filler piece at the end of the news on a long weekend. On a slow news day, you'll always see some wonderful thing that's meant to be coming out of research that feels like a bit of a filler piece. I'd like to see better communication with consumers and consumer groups, because not only is that going to drive better research and better research outcomes, I think it's also going to encourage consumers to talk about research and to want to get involved in research. Because at the moment, people aren't asking after diagnosis, is there a clinical trial I can get involved in? And they're not asking because they think clinical trials are bad, they're asking because they don't know they can ask that. And I think researchers and clinicians have a role in communicating those results. So there's a few more, I've just jumped through, but there's a list there of some of the references that I've mentioned in the talk that people can look up when they get the presentation. So thank you.